Recording.
All right.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Christine Ingram. I'm the local interest librarian here at the New Hanover County Public Library. Today marks the kickoff of a three-part series here at the library on the Wilmington Campaign, and today we have Kaitlin O'Connor. Kaitlin is a public historian at the Fort Fisher State Historic Site. She's particularly interested in African American history and public programming to share their stories. At Fort Fisher, Kaitlin serves as education and outreach coordinator. She earned her bachelor's degree in history and will soon complete her master's in public history, both from NC State University. Today's program will provide a fresh overview of the Civil War Wilmington Campaign through an examination of the diverse people caught up in the battles. The microhistory highlights the roles of a few soldiers, laborers, and civilians to investigate the human experience of the military campaign in January and February of 1865. The presentation caps the opening weekend of Fort Fisher's new program called Dwell with Gratitude and Pride, New Perspectives on the Wilmington Campaign, which highlights the human experiences of the campaign to capture the port city. Various tours, presentations, and programs are offered weekly from January 7th through February 23rd. For events in the Dwell with Gratitude and Pride program, please see the social media and website of Fort Fisher State Historic Site. We also have a pamphlet in the back that lists all of the events as well. The program includes 2 more presentations here at the New Hanover County Library on January 24th and February 23rd. And I'll give a little bit more information at the very end about those. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kaitlin. Yeah.
Thank you. No clap. Yeah, I haven't said anything yet. All right. Well, thank you, Christine, for that introduction. You summarized my talk perhaps more succinctly than I will. So, as you said, my name is Kaitlin. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator down at Fort Fisher in Curry Beach. And today I'm going to be sharing some of the stories of the history of the Wilmington Campaign through the experiences and perspectives of people who lived through it. So, I forgot my pointer, so I have to use my mouse here today. All right, so this is part of our Dwell with Gratitude and Pride series running from now until just about the end of February. And the goal of this series is really to expand our understanding of what happened here in the Civil War and commemorate both the forced and free contributions of all sorts of people caught up in the campaign. So while we're really used to hearing about Confederates and white Union soldiers who fairly did comprise the bulk of the fighting force here, this series is really going to highlight Asian, Hispanic, Black, and American Indians throughout the campaign. And so for us to really understand what happened in the past and how it impacts us today, we really do need to wrestle with these diverse perspectives and experiences. So if we truly want to understand what happened here in the Wilmington Campaign, that's what we need to do. I like to say it as, if I wanted to understand what happened at your last family Thanksgiving dinner, I would need to talk to everybody who was there to get a true understanding. I can't just talk to 1 or 2 of you, otherwise I'm going to hear from Grandpa about how the quarterback missed an easy throw, and from Grandma about how potatoes were all mushy when they should have been lumpy. It's just not the whole story, right? So that's what historians do, or at least they should do. Study this broad perspective, get as many different views as possible, weigh them against each other, and create a coherent narrative about the past. And that's what we're going to do here today to give you a better understanding of the whole of the Wilmington Campaign. Oops. All right. So, I want to start today by talking about Calvin Oxendine. He was a young man in Robeson County when the war broke out in 1861. So he worked as a day laborer, helping out at local farms and shops to make ends meet. And he was listed as mulatto in the 1860 census, but he's really an American Indian in what we now know as the Lumbee tribe. And in The early parts of the Civil War, young lumpy men volunteered to serve in Confederate regiments. But too often they were turned away or discharged when white Confederates found out that they were indigenous and not, in fact, white people. And so in 1863, Calvin found himself among those serving the Confederacy, but it was not by choice. See, Confederates needed to build an extensive defensive network of Wilmington as a vital port city for the South. And in the first year of the war, a lot of that labor comes from enslavers voluntarily sending off their enslaved people to Wilmington to build those defenses. We say voluntarily, meaning the enslavers voluntarily sent them. Those people, of course, were still separated by force from their families. But extensive physical labor, as well as exposure to disease and the elements, really took their toll on these laborers. And these enslavers really started to put their patriotism on hold, which they initially used to send off these enslaved laborers. They put their patriotism on hold when the physical toll on their workers became an issue for their bottom line. And so this labor force really started to dry up. And so in December of 1862, North Carolina passed two laws. One required enslavers to send off enslaved people to build defenses of Wilmington, and the other required free people of color to contribute to the defensive works as well. So while today we would not call Lumbee people of color, they would in the 1860s. In fact, this 1862 law specifically targets people of color in Robeson County, which is overwhelmingly people of what we now know as the Lumbee tribe. And so in early 1863, Calvin was forcibly rounded up by the Confederate Home Guard and brought down here to Wilmington. He served as an unwilling laborer and building Fort Fisher and likely other works in the area. He's one of hundreds of American Indians and thousands of enslaved African and free African Americans as well in this backbreaking construction to build the defenses here. White Confederates certainly contributed to the construction of their own forts, but all too often they would call this labor detail arduous and unsuitable for white men. And so as often as possible, Confederate officers would seek out and put to work these American Indians and African American construction crews and work them harder than they would their white soldiers. So, a little perspective on the map of what's going on here. Calvin, those other American Indians, as well as the enslaved and free African Americans are, oh, my animation should have all popped up, all these triangles. Let me get them all up here for you. Okay, so this is a highlight of most, though certainly not all, of the defenses of Wilmington, built from March of 1861 all the way until February of 1865. From a modern perspective, it might seem kind of reasonable to build all of this in the span of almost 4 years. But I just spoke to somebody yesterday on my tour who said she's down in Oak Island, has been waiting 19 months for the building of her own house, a very modest home. So even with modern equipment and modern technology, this would be a feat. And this was all built using manual labor by hand, the assistance of very modest tools. And so as the war progresses and Wilmington becomes the only viable port city in the Confederacy by mid-1864, the pressure on these laborers really starts to ramp up. More and more people are pulled into this system and worked harder and harder to build and fortify these defenses along the Cape Fear to ensure the South has that supply line. leading up to Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. So I wanted to start with Calvin's story because he is quite literally setting the physical stage for the Wilmington Campaign. And it's important for us to acknowledge the contributions and the suffering of the people who were made to build all of these defenses that we now study as part of our Wilmington Campaign. I'll turn your attention to Henry Davis. Henry was enslaved in or near Wilmington before the war. It's all too common with victims of human trafficking and slavery. We really don't know much about his life in slavery. But what we do know is pretty remarkable. Just after Christmas in 1861, Henry began the long journey rowing his way down from Wilmington, down the Cape Fear River to the Atlantic Ocean. Depending on where he started, this could take 6 or more hours. And he's going to travel under the cover of darkness to avoid detection. He's sneaking past multiple points of Confederate forts to get to his freedom. And on December 27th, he finally reaches the USS Mount Vernon. The Navy ship was patrolling the waters off of Fort Fisher in an attempt to enforce a blockade against the port city. And seemingly just as often as these blockaders actually stopped a Confederate trade ship, they would find people like Henry who are what we would call self-emancipating or taking the initiative to free themselves by escaping to the Union Navy. Black men and occasionally Black women and children took this chance time and time again throughout the war. And so far we have documented 60 African Americans who self-emancipated by way of escape down the Cape Fear River to the Union Navy during the Civil War. Even more made this journey, but either chose not to or could not enlist in the Navy. Instead, they would stay on board until the next port of call and then make their way to Northern controlled territory to begin their lives as free people. But Henry does enlist in the Navy. He'll actually go on to serve on the Mount Vernon until March 1865. And he participates in the opening battle of the Wilmington Campaign in December 1864, which we call the first battle of Fort Fisher, but at the time he was hoping it would just be the Battle of Fort Fisher. So while he was on board, Black men were often relegated to labor roles, coal heavers, essentially body servants of white officers. Henry was no exception, so he contributed while he could to the battle. His ears were ringing as the Navy fired over 1 million pounds of iron into Fort Fisher on December 24th and 25th of 1864. And he heard about the Black and white Union soldiers who were landing on the beach in preparation for the land assault on the fort. And as busy as he was on the ship, Henry really hoped this battle would be the first step to liberate his loved ones he had left behind in Wilmington all those years ago. See, the war was always about freedom for Henry. And now it was quite literally at the doorstep of his former home. It was nearly 3 years to the day when he left Wilmington and joined the Navy. And when those Navy guns went silent on Christmas Day, 1864, and the sailors realized that the Army failed to capture Fort Fisher, I believe Henry's heart must have sank lower than anyone else's on board, because now Wilmington remained in the hands of the Confederacy, and all those people he left behind that he grew up with and shared every type of relationship with in Wilmington were still in bondage in their homeland. Henry escaped during the Christmas holiday, which was a time where enslavers would often permit light duty or even a full break of work between Christmas and New Year's Day. And it was a bittersweet break for enslaved people. was a time of community, of rest and fellowship, but they're also dreading January 1st. That's called Heartbreak Day for the enslaved people. That is when enslavers would rent out their enslaved people to others to have laborers for a given contract of a few months to upwards of a year. So once again, on Heartbreak Day, families would be separated and continued this cycle of slavery. And so I suspect that Henry was really hoping that Wilmington had seen the last of Heartbreak Day. But as the Union turned around and left Wilmington, he realized that there's going to be a Heartbreak Day on January 1st, 1865. And Mount Vernon, his ship was assigned to other duties, so he's going to miss the rest of the Wilmington campaign. But after the war, he'll come back to Wilmington, settle here, live here all throughout Reconstruction and into the turn of the 20th century. Henry dies here in 1912, and in fact, this is his headstone. He is buried at the National Cemetery here in town, recognized as one of the Union veterans of this campaign. Well, the Union does come back to Fort Fisher. There is a second battle in mid-January of 1865. And one of the soldiers that find themselves on the front line of the U.S. Army's infantry attack on the post is Private Bruce Anderson of the 142nd New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment. So on January 15th, he and his fellow soldiers are preparing to assault and charge up those big hills of Fort Fisher. There's just one thing that stands in their way. For 2.5 days beforehand, January 13th through about the midday on the 15th, U.S. Navy has bombarded Fort Fisher once again. This time they do a really good job of knocking out a good number of the cannons. But that palisade fence line in front of the fort still stands, particularly where the Army soldiers are preparing their assaults. They can't push forward yet, or they'll be slowed down and mowed down by the Confederate defenders. And so Bruce and 15 other men volunteer to charge forward across open land with nothing but pickaxes to hack down that palisade fence line. This is a near suicide mission for these men. Miraculously, Bruce survives and he lives well into the late 1800s. And he is actually recommended for the Medal of Honor for his actions. And Bruce was born actually in 1845 in Mexico. So that makes him one of the very first Hispanic Americans to earn the Medal of Honor. And that's right here at Fort Fisher. January 15th wasn't such a happy day for everybody here in Wilmington. So before the battles, life at Fort Fisher and most of these other Confederate forts in the area is relatively peaceful. Occasionally, you'd exchange cannon fire with those Navy blockaders, and you have to fight off the heat and the mosquitoes and the snakes and all that element that comes in with living down here in the hot summers. But at least they're not on campaigns throughout Virginia. They're not marching all the time. They're really not in big battles, really ever. And so a lot of them bring their families to Wilmington. A lot of the Confederate soldiers, like Sergeant Thaddeus Davis, have their wives down here. So Susan is the wife of Thaddeus, and she lives in Wilmington for the bulk of the war. Now the Confederates know the Union is coming back, and they prepare accordingly. Families and loved ones will be sent off into Wilmington for safety. And so when they start to hear the gunfire of that naval bombardment, they head out of town on the west bank of the Cape Fear River. Fort Fisher is on the east bank. And they try to watch from across the river what is happening. And so Susan and her fellow wives of Confederate soldiers here bring their looking glass and their binoculars down, and watch in horror to see those little gray and blue ants in between the black smoke covering the field. And decades later, Susan actually wrote down her observations while she watched this battle unfold. She said, "We could count our hearts beat as, with silent prayers and eyes too dry for tears, we watched the storm gather in great masses of dark columns of men moving on the helpless but still defiant Confederates. Praying that my husband was yet alive, seeing the overwhelming odds against him, and realizing that victory was utterly hopeless. Can I be blamed that courage failed me and that a white flag over the wrecked fort would have been grateful to my sight?" And Susan really could do nothing but watch those little gray dots from across the river get pushed further and further down the mile stretch of Fort Fisher. She wasn't sure if her husband was one of those gray dots retreating, or if he was one of the very still gray dots on the ground somewhere behind the Blue Army. And she wouldn't know for over a month until one day she receives a letter from Elmira, New York, at a prisoner of war camp, where Thaddeus is able to write and tell her that he is okay, but has been captured. And for the next few months, she never hears another word, and she's concerned. Is he alive? Is he wounded? Is he getting sick at the POW camps? She continues in daily anxiety until her husband comes home in June of 1865. So this is what we'll do today. I'll give you some stories, and we'll zoom back out to the map so you put this in a little perspective. So the battles of Fort Fisher take place at the very end of this peninsula here. Right here, Fort Fisher's under this big old star. And so this is where the Union establishes their foothold for this campaign. Grab this. All right. Okay. So now we'll turn our attention to John Pratt, who was a member of the U.S. colored troops throughout this campaign. Specifically, he was in the 30th Regiment. And so that means he's serving an all-black segregated unit in the United States Army. And so John and his fellow USCT soldiers are a really important part of the Battle of Fort Fisher. Briefly, the U.S. colored troops hold the rear line about a mile or so north of Fort Fisher, and they prevent Confederate reinforcements from traveling south from Wilmington area down into Fort Fisher. They prevent the white Union soldiers from being surrounded during the battle. So I don't think their efforts receive enough praise. If the Union soldiers had been sandwiched at Fort Fisher, it could have been very likely the second failed attack at Fort Fisher. But USCTs do hold off those Confederate advancements. They skirmish with them, they have light battle, but they're still relatively fresh. They have not battled over a massive fort for the better part of 4 or 5 hours in close hand-to-hand combat like the white soldiers had. And so just a few days after Fort Fisher falls, the Union leadership sends Pratt and other USCT soldiers on reconnaissance missions north from Fort Fisher, trying to test out Sugarloaf, which is the Confederate post closest to Fort Fisher, north of Carolina Beach today. And so they get a good sense of what's going on, but the Army is going to rest up until just about mid-February of 1865, until they can resupply. So on February 11th, U.S. colored troops lead the charge up from Fort Fisher and to Sugarloaf, where they're going to engage those Confederate defenders. Pratt later recalled that we went up several times to the breastworks they had. The last time we went up and drove their pickets in, we threw up breastworks in sight. So what's happening during this battle of Sugarloaf is the Union soldiers are advancing, fighting off the Confederates as best they can, but really unable to get a good foothold to break through the Southern lines. They continue time and time again to try to break the lines of February 11th into February 12th, when they discover the Confederates have actually given up Sugarloaf and retreated further north into town. Sugarloaf is actually the deadliest day in the campaign for United States colored troops, with nearly 100 casualties. And it's the second highest casualty rate for all United States forces throughout the campaign. So to put on the map for you, Sugarloaf is about 10 miles or so north of Fort Fisher. We've already captured Fort Fisher. It's what this X is for now. And the Union's moving further north to Sugarloaf, which is right by that bridge you drive over to come into Carolina Beach today. So the Union is slowly making their way up towards Wilmington right here. Okay. And so I mentioned USCTs really forced the Confederates to retreat. And so as they're retreating back towards Wilmington, Hosea Horn of one of the Confederate artillery regiments stops by his boyhood home and says hello to his mother, Catherine Lanier Horn. He spent a little time there before his troops continued to move on towards Wilmington. And the next day, the Union soldiers giving chase, one of them asked for permission to leave the line to go visit his boyhood home. And that's Corporal Jacob Horn of the 2nd North Carolina U.S. Infantry Regiment. And there's a reporter from Philadelphia actually with the Union soldiers on this march, and he would report that Jacob was soon clasped in the arms of his overjoyed mother. She said, "Your brother was here yesterday. He stopped as the Confederates marched past," giving a little credence to this local legend of the Horn brothers here. This would have taken place near where Monkey Junction is today in Wilmington, halfway between Sugarloaf and the downtown area. And so how Jacob aligned with the United States is open for debate and speculation here in town. Some claim that he went willingly to the Union Navy blockaders and wanted to serve in the United States. Others say that Jacob was a Confederate soldier captured near Beaufort, North Carolina, and offered service in lieu of prison. I don't have a theory to offer or contribute here today, other than to point out, for one reason or another, he's one of about 10,000 white North Carolinians who will serve in the Union Army. Many are Unionists through and through and want to fight for the United States. Others were Confederate deserters or Confederate soldiers captured or just lured in by sizable enlistment bonuses. Either way, it's an important story because sometimes we hear about white North Carolinians were aligned with the Confederacy. That's not always necessarily the case, even in a strong pro-secessionist area like Wilmington. All right, so we talked a little bit about what's going on that east bank from Sugarloaf up towards Wilmington. But after the Battle of Fort Fisher, the U.S. Navy is actually able to enter into the Cape Fear River. They couldn't before, because if they tried, well, the Confederates at Fort Fisher would shoot them with their cannons. So that problem is taken care of now, and these smaller ships can start to sail up the river. In addition, we'll have white Union soldiers land in what's now Southport and make their way north on the west bank of the Cape Fear River. And so I want to talk a little bit about John Howe. He's on the USS Patuxent throughout this Wilmington campaign. John, which is likely his English name, was born in Hong Kong around 1834. At the time, Hong Kong was part of the Qing dynasty. When John was really young, The dynasty and the United Kingdom fought a war over China's opium trade ban, which really resulted in the United Kingdom controlling Hong Kong, which, as you might remember, they do until the 1990s. And so it's likely that John travels internationally through connections with the British Empire, British trade empire in particular, and sees the world. He's likely a merchant marine in some capacity. That's how he ends up in New York in 1864, when he enlists and serves as a cook in the Navy. On board, he's doing his best he can, keep his soldiers fed, his sailors fed, and not complaining too much about chow on board. And when the Patuxent enters the Cape Fear River after the capture of Fort Fisher, the ship starts to assist in that push up the river into Wilmington. These Navy ships will provide cannon fire to Army forces advancing on the ground, either on the west bank or on the east banks. They're able to provide cover fire. And so in mid-February 1865, Howe's ship, the Patuxent, starts to fire upon Fort Anderson and Town Creek. And John is one of only, quite literally, a few hundred Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans living on the east coast of the United States during the Civil War. What's remarkable is that nearly all of those eligible Chinese Americans serve, and they serve in the Union Navy in particular, showing their patriotism and support for their new nation. So, once again, to put it into perspective here, we've got Fort Fisher capture. The troops like Pratt are moving up. Where's someone else? They're moving up the east bank, and now they're getting towards Wilmington. On the west bank, we have the Confederates abandoning Fort Anderson and a battle at Town Creek. They're going to start pushing their way up this west bank towards Wilmington. So the abandonment of Fort Anderson and Town Creek takes place around February 19th through 20th of 1865. Oh, there we go. All right, so we really don't have too much left. If you know your local history, you know Wilmington falls on February 22nd. So we only have a couple more days. There's some really key activity happening in the meantime. So Charles Paine is the commander of the 3rd Division of the United States Army here in the Wilmington Campaign. He leads 9 U.S. colored troop regiments. He earns his post in the summer of 1864. And being the leader of U.S. colored troop regiments is something he really values. Charles grew up in Boston. He's actually the grandson of a signer to the Declaration of Independence. And he's an ardent abolitionist, which is pretty common for officers of U.S. colored troop regiments. But more than that, he's an integrationist, which is a little more uncommon for even white officers of Black regiments at the time. And so he leads this 3rd Division with all 9 regiments of colored troops throughout the Wilmington Campaign. Unlike other colored troop leaders, he really wants to use his men as soldiers and not laborers or support details for the army. And he does that wherever he could. For example, not long after he takes over command in 1864, he leads men into the Battle of Newmarket Heights in September 1864, where several of his soldiers are recommended for the Medal of Honor. So they're really putting their money where their mouth is and fighting as men together. And so Paine brings his men to what we call the Battle of Forks Road, really the last standoff of this Wilmington campaign. And so he orders his men into relentless attack against the Confederates at Forks Road. So they're limited by the landscape and the number of troops available. So the U.S. colored troops are really advancing in single line formation, which is a little unusual at this time when you have multiple layers of troops marching forward. So each of these lines is pretty easily turned around and beat back, but they relentlessly continue for upwards of 36 hours, wave after wave after wave, trying to find a spot to break through this Confederate line and push finally into Wilmington. So they're unable to do that on February 20th or 21st, but they keep preparing for more. Wilmington's just up the road, and they refuse to let this last line stop them. And so when they wake up, they realize the Confederates have retreated out of Wilmington once again. So here's the Battle of Forks Road on the map. That results, of course, in a USA victory. Well, here's some people sometimes say it was a draw, but when your enemy leaves the battlefield and retreat, I'd say that's a win for you. So they continue on into the capture of Wilmington, which happens February 22nd, 1865. And so to their surprise, they enter into a bit of a parade here in town. One of the white soldiers of the U.S. Army tells us a bit about entering Wilmington and their surprise. He's Theodore Skinner, who's the U.S. infantryman, wrote to his brother saying, "Wilmington is ours. The place is strongly fortified. It doesn't seem as if they would go and leave such works. It must be that the rebellion is about finished. It must make old Jeff," meaning Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, "must make old Jeff feel rather weak in the knees to have so many of the Yanks at work in his rear." And so, for men like Skinner, is really about putting that final nail in the coffin of the Confederacy. That last port city is captured. That's not really what this has been about for a lot of the troops marching into town. So, for example, J.H. Paine, he's a member of the U.S. Colored Troop regiments. In fact, he is late to the campaign, probably because of illness or injury. He did not join the troops as they battled Fort Fisher and pushed into Wilmington. He arrives late, so late, in fact, that his transport ship drops him off the wharf here in downtown Wilmington after it's already been captured to reunite with his regiment. So as he disembarks, Paine reflects on just how monumentous the capture of Wilmington really is. And yeah, they closed the last port city. Yeah, the Confederacy's out of supplies. But he cares about something else. He notes that Wilmington has so long been disgraced by the curse of slavery, but now, thank God, that foul curse is swept away. So celebrations of freedom from free and now formerly enslaved people continue for days. On the first Sunday after liberation, these people gather for Christian worship services, often led by U.S. Colored Troop chaplains. And Paine went to some of these ceremonies and was touched by just the raw emotion he witnessed from these now free people. He said, "Oh, could you have been here to witness their expressions and tokens of joy on that occasion? Even in their religious exercises, you could not otherwise than been animated and delighted to hear and see them." So that joy really turned to action. U.S. Colored Troops set up a recruiting station here in Wilmington, and hundreds of Black men flock to enlist and continue what has always been for them this war of freedom. So I want to leave you with one more thought today. That is from George Arnold of the 4th USCT Regiment. After the capture of Wilmington, the U.S. Colored Troops and the rest of the white soldiers push into central North Carolina. They make their way eventually into Raleigh in April and May of 1865, where they'll be discharged. And so as they're preparing for discharge and to return to their civilian lives, some of them for the first time as free people, George really wants to inspire his fellow soldiers. He's a senior NCO, so he's going to give them some motivation as they go off into the civilian world. He wants them to take pride in their service, remember their sacrifices, but also to continue this fight for freedom and democracy that they've really started in this war. So in April 1865, he pens a letter to his comrades. And his letter is actually where we get the title of our series, Dwell with Gratitude and Pride. It is also where we get the title of my talk today, "'Tis Grand to Know." He wrote, "When our children shall read of the deeds of heroism of our regiment, recorded on the most glorious page of American history, their names associated with the proudest war-worn veterans, 'tis grand to know they can dwell with gratitude and pride upon their fame. When disputed aright on account of their color, that they may say, the deeds of valor of my father who served the Republic in the greatest hour of her need, won my title to American citizenship. I demand it. I must have it." So unfortunately, we all know what happens after Civil War and Reconstruction with the second subjugation of Black people under Jim Crow in the South. But I think it's important, and thank you all for pausing with me today, to mark this awesome achievement in the Civil War, this moment of liberation and freedom earned by all of these people we have talked about today. Well, I guess except for Susan Davis, who's on the wrong side of this equation. That's okay. For me, it's really knowing and appreciating the valor, the grit, and achievement of these men really kind of helps me to dwell with gratitude and pride as we get into the anniversary of the Wilmington Campaign in February and January, these next months here in the Wilmington region. So I hope these stories help you to do the same. And as Christine mentioned, we have upcoming events in our new series on the Wilmington Campaign. The next few, like I mentioned, there's one every week. The next three, next week we have our artillery program and battle anniversary at Fort Fisher. We'll be firing the cannon. We also have living historians talking about Civil War medicine, which is an important part of the Wilmington Campaign, and live for veterans after. And then the following Saturday, we have more living historians out at Fort Fisher. We have a member of one of the Pennsylvania regiments who is here, and nurses talking about their role in the campaign. And then on January 24th, as Christine's getting ready to talk about, we'll be right back here for our next speaker series. So if you're from the area, we hope to see you out in one or more of our programs all the way through the end of February. Thank you, guys. Do you have any questions for me? Yes, ma'am.
So in your research into the lives of these individuals, have you been able to locate any of their descendants and talk to them about their stories?
Yeah, it's a great question. In here, she was asking if I've been able to find descendants from some of these guys. Not yet. I only started working at Fort Fisher about 10 months ago, so I haven't gotten there yet, but Cameron Art Museum is doing incredible work. They, as you might know, are actually researching all of these 9 U.S. colored troop regiments that were here, and they are having call for descendants. They're trying to trace from soldier to living descendants so they can connect people to their ancestors and collect these stories. So Fort Fisher is not doing this work, but Cameron Art Museum is. What we are trying to do slowly but surely is gather the names of the enslaved laborers and American Indian laborers, and eventually we'll be doing the same thing for their descendants. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Going back to the first, you were talking this as a Lumbee gentleman. You brought up a map of all the different places that people were forced to work for. They weren't all forts, right? Like what other kinds of construction would?
Yeah, let me pull up just one of those slides again.
I'm just curious if they were like building roads or something like that.
Yeah, so these guys, stupid animations. There we go. So like I said, this is just most of the defenses, not all of them. Some are true forts like Fort Fisher, Fort Anderson, Fort Caswell. Others are what we would essentially call rifle pits or defensive trench lines. Others are kind of in between in size. They try to make them into something more and then run out of time. So they'd really be doing everything. They're also likely, repairing roads because there are thousands of soldiers and thousands of laborers throughout Wilmington area getting supplies. So that's going to wear down the infrastructure of the area as well. On top of that, we have shipbuilding operations here. And while I'm not too sure if there's enslaved labor building those ships, I wouldn't be surprised if there is. I just haven't studied it, so I can't speak on it. There's people all around contributing to that kind of work and infrastructure as well. Does that answer your question? I kind of forgot what your question was while I was answering it.
I was just curious what all they were made to work on.
Yeah, so most of the people I talked about, like Calvin, they're physically building defensive works, forts, and rifle pits. But others are actually brought with their enslaver, who is a soldier, and essentially serve as a body servant. Others serve, I've had one account of somebody who tends to the horses as an enslaved person. So there's little bits of different roles here. Basically, every sort of role you can imagine an enslaved person would be forced to do in the antebellum era. There's probably an enslaved person doing it here in Wilmington during the Civil War as well. I mean, why would the Confederates give up what they're used to for the sake of morality? All right. Well, I hope to see you guys out in future programs, but otherwise enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Oh, I'm sorry, Christine, it's gonna wrap up.
Sorry. Are you the one leading towards the Sugarloaf?
Yes, I will be leading it with one of my coworkers.
All right, thank you so much for joining us today. I will mention the 2 upcoming programs that we will have here in this room. The next one is going to be January 24th, which is a Tuesday, and it'll be at 11 a.m. That's going to be Remember Forever, the changing story of the Wilmington Campaign. Kaitlin will be joining us along with one of her colleagues, Becky Sawyer. They will be talking about how soldiers and civilians responded to the news of the Wilmington Campaign during the Civil War and how our understanding of these events has transformed over time. Discover how and why our understanding of the past changes and what that means for us today. And then in conclusion, the final program that we'll be having is going to be on February 23rd. Which is going to be a Thursday, and that'll be in this room at 5:30. A panel of local historians will discuss the experience of the diverse people involved in the Wilmington Campaign and how Wilmington adjusted to emancipation and peace. A moderator will guide the discussion, and the audience members are welcome, and please bring questions of your own. If you have any questions, you can reach out to Kaitlin. Her information is on this pamphlet, or to me, and I will give you that information after we have finished here today. Thank you all so much for joining us, and if you parked on the 3rd floor, let me know and I can give you a parking pass, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.